I grew up surrounded by the woods. The smell of pine, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the distant calls of birds, it all felt like home to me. My father and brothers loved hunting, and from as far back as I can remember, I tagged along on their trips. These weren't just outings, they were adventures. My father, always calm and composed, taught me how to follow tracks, recognize animal sounds, and respect the wilderness. It felt like I was learning something secret, something only we shared. Hunting trips were my favorite times. There was a sense of pride in being included with the men, even though I was much younger. I liked the feeling of accomplishment, setting traps, waiting for game, and listening to my father tell stories about the forest. Those memories blend together into one long stretch of warmth, crackling fires, the sharp scent of wood smoke, and the quiet bond between us. I thought the forest held no secrets from me. We'd been through it so many times that it felt as familiar as my own backyard. There was safety in the routine, in knowing that my father was always nearby, ready to guide and protect. I never imagined that the forest could change, that it could become something strange and unsettling. But it did, one autumn evening, when I was around 8 or 9 years old. That day started like any other hunting trip. My father and I left early in the morning, the sky still pale and streaked with light. We packed light, just some traps, a small cooler with snacks, and his rifle. The forest wasn't far from our house, and we knew it well. We hiked along familiar paths, setting traps for small animals and stopping every so often to talk about wildlife. The day passed in an easy rhythm. We found animal tracks, checked our traps, and enjoyed the quiet hum of the forest around us. I always felt a kind of peaceful thrill on these trips, like I was part of something bigger. The hours slipped by unnoticed, and soon the sunlight softened, dipping lower behind the trees. We decided to head back before it got too dark, but then something shifted. The air grew cooler, heavier somehow. It was subtle at first, like a distant pressure in the air. I tried to brush it off, but the silence made the forest feel different, like it was holding its breath. Then we heard it. A sound carried through the trees, a high, thin cry, faint but unmistakable. It wasn't an animal. It sounded like a person, calling out, almost pleading. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I looked at my father. His face changed instantly. His usual calm vanished, replaced by a tension I'd never seen before. Without saying a word, he put a hand on my shoulder and told me to stay put. "Don't move," he said, his voice low and firm. Then he turned and headed toward the sound, disappearing into the trees. I sat on a fallen log as I watched the spot where my father had vanished, waiting for him to reappear. The minutes stretched on longer than they should have, and the forest around me seemed to grow darker with every second. The silence felt strange, too complete, like the whole forest was listening. I told myself to stay still like my father had asked, but the longer I sat there, the harder it became. The forest didn't feel familiar anymore. Shadows stretched long over the ground, and everything seemed sharper and closer, like the woods were closing in around me. The air felt cold against my skin, and the silence pressed on my ears. I tried to stay calm, but a gnawing worry started to grow. What was taking my father so long? What if something had happened to him? The thought unsettled me in a way I couldn't explain, and before I knew it, I was standing, brushing leaves off my pants. I told myself I just needed to find him, just to see him and know everything was okay. I took a few steps in the direction he had gone, the crunch of leaves sounding too loud under my boots. The woods around me looked different now, unfamiliar in the fading light. I kept walking, each step making my chest feel tighter. I called out softly, "Dad?" There was no answer, just the steady hum of silence. The farther I walked, the more everything felt wrong. The trees seemed taller, their branches arching overhead like jagged ribs. I kept my eyes on the path, but from the corners of my vision I saw movement. Shapes shifting between the trunks, there one moment and gone the next. I blinked, trying to convince myself it was just the shadows playing tricks on me. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more the figures seemed to move, always at the edge of my sight. My pulse raced, and I clenched my fists to keep from trembling. The cold air stung my face, and the sense of unease grew stronger with every step. I opened my mouth to call for my father again, but before I could, I heard something. Footsteps. Not mine. They came from behind me, fast and deliberate, the sound of dry leaves crunching under heavy boots. I turned sharply. Then, through the gathering shadows, I saw him. My father was running toward me, his face pale and filled with something I didn't recognize: fear. He didn't say anything. He just grabbed my arm, his grip tight and urgent, and pulled me with him. Run was all I could think, and we did, sprinting through the forest as the light faded and the shadows deepened around us. We ran through the forest, my father's grip tight around my arm. I struggled to keep up, my breath coming in short bursts, but he didn't slow down. The sound of our feet slamming against the earth echoed through the silent woods, each step louder than it should have been. It felt like the forest was awake now. Branches snapped underfoot, and the rustling of unseen movement surrounded us. I glanced back once, hoping to see nothing, but my stomach dropped. Shadows shifted between the trees, sliding along the edges of the path, never coming fully into view. My father yanked me forward, his pace relentless, as if he knew we couldn't stop, not even for a second. The forest twisted in on itself. I recognized nothing, not the familiar bends in the trail or the landmarks we had passed earlier. It was as if the woods had rearranged, becoming something I no longer knew. All I could do was trust my father, follow his lead, and run faster than I thought I could. Finally, through the thick tangle of trees, I saw it. Our car parked on the dirt road, a beacon of safety. We burst out of the forest, the cold night air hitting us hard as we sprinted for the car. My father threw open the door, shoved me inside, and slammed it shut behind us. Without a word, he started the engine. Gravel crunched beneath the tires as we sped down the narrow road, leaving the forest behind. I wanted to ask what had happened, what we were running from, but something about his silence held me back. It felt fragile, like if I spoke, it would shatter whatever thin control he was holding on to. So I sat there in the passenger seat, staring out into the dark, trying to piece together what little I knew. When we pulled into our driveway, my father finally exhaled, as if he had been holding his breath the whole way home. He turned off the engine but didn't move, his hands still on the wheel. I looked at him, waiting for him to say something, anything, but he only shook his head slowly, like he was trying to shake off whatever had followed us from the forest. I asked him what had happened, what he had seen. His answer was short and unsettling. Nothing you need to worry about. In the days that followed, things seemed to return to normal. My father acted like nothing had happened, slipping back into his usual routines. But I knew something was different. He avoided talking about that night, brushing off my questions with vague reassurances. I, on the other hand, couldn't stop thinking about. It didn't make sense. He wasn't the kind of man who scared easily. Whatever he had seen, it was enough to shake him in a way I had never seen before. I kept pressing him for answers, hoping he would tell me what he saw, but he never did. Over the years, every time I brought it up, he would give me the same answer: "It's better if you don't know." I've always enjoyed a good challenge. For as long as I can remember, hiking solo has been my thing. Just me, the trail, and the satisfaction of pushing myself through the toughest terrain I could find. So when I came across a trail near the border that promised to be steep, remote, and barely marked, I couldn't resist. At 25, I felt more than ready for it, prepared, fit, and experienced enough to handle whatever it threw at me. The plan was simple: start early, tackle the toughest stretches while the sun was up, and finish by 5 in the evening. I wasn't worried. I'd completed longer and harder hikes before. The trailhead was quiet that morning when I parked my car. There were no signs of other hikers, no footprints or chatter to break the silence, just the stillness of the forest and the faint hum of insects waking with the sun. The air felt crisp as I started the hike, my boots crunching against the dirt path. It was exactly what I had hoped for: untouched nature, no distractions, and a trail that seemed just wild enough to keep me on my toes. The trail turned out to be more challenging than I had anticipated. Steeper inclines forced me to slow down, and tangled roots hidden beneath the fallen leaves kept catching my boots, making me stumble more than once. The narrow paths wound unpredictably through thick clusters of trees, forcing me to navigate carefully. It wasn't long before I realized my pace was slower than I had planned. The sun was sinking faster than I expected, and I still had a good stretch to cover. I wasn't panicked, just annoyed. I knew I could finish before nightfall if I kept moving steadily. But as the hours slipped by, the atmosphere shifted. The forest around me grew quieter, the sounds of birds and insects fading away one by one. I glanced at my watch and realized how far behind schedule I was. I reached for my headlamp, ready to power through the final stretch under the glow of artificial light. But before I could switch it on, something caught my eye, a flicker of light far off the trail. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but there it was again, a faint flicker of flashlights, deep within the forest and far from where any hikers should be. My heart picked up speed. It was strange enough for anyone to be off the trail at dusk, but the fact that there were multiple lights moving quickly through the trees set me on edge. Instinct kicked in, and I crouched behind a bush, careful to stay out of sight. The lights bobbed and weaved through the forest, and soon I could make out 4 figures, all moving with a sense of urgency. They weren't wandering or lost, they were searching for something, or someone. As the figures drew closer, I held my breath, straining to hear their conversation. The forest was so quiet that their voices carried easily through the trees. "He should be here," one of them muttered, frustration clear in his voice. The group continued searching, their flashlights sweeping the area methodically. My pulse raced. I didn't know who they were or what they were looking for, but everything about them felt wrong. I stayed frozen, praying they wouldn't notice me. The group passed uncomfortably close to where I was hiding, their flashlights cutting across the trees. I kept my breathing shallow, counting the seconds until they would move on. Finally, their footsteps grew fainter, and their voices faded into the distance as they continued down the trail. I waited until I was certain they were gone, then slowly emerged from my hiding spot. My legs felt stiff, and my heart was still pounding in my chest. I glanced around, trying to make sense of what I had just witnessed. It wasn't uncommon for hikers to get lost, but this didn't feel like that. There was an urgency to the way they moved, a focus in their search that left me uneasy. Whoever they were, they hadn't been out for a casual hike. I shook off the lingering unease and forced myself to focus on the trail ahead. I just needed to get back to the trailhead and leave this place behind. The sooner I was out of the forest, the better. Then I saw someone coming toward me, a man walking briskly along the trail, his face calm but alert. Relief washed over me. At least I wasn't the only one out here. Seeing another person out on the trail was an unexpected relief. I waved as the man approached, hoping for some reassurance after the unsettling encounter with the group earlier. When he reached me, I quickly explained what I had seen. 4 people with flashlights, wandering deep in the forest, looking for someone. I told him about the strange way they moved, like they were hunting, not hiking. He listened carefully, his expression unreadable, though his eyes flickered with what seemed like concern. "It's better if we head back together," he finally said. "Getting off this trail as soon as possible seems like a good idea." I agreed without hesitation. Even though I didn't know this man, having someone with me felt safer. We set off down the path, walking briskly but not so fast that we'd lose our footing. The forest around us was silent, unnaturally so. The man kept glancing over his shoulder, which only made my nerves worse. I tried not to look back, afraid I might see those figures again, following us from the depths of the forest. When we finally reached the trailhead, I felt a wave of relief, until I noticed something that stopped me cold. There, just off the side of the trail, half hidden among the trees, was an old, beat-up car. I hadn't seen it when I started my hike earlier in the day, and its sudden appearance felt wrong. The car looked like it had been parked hastily. The way it was angled, partly concealed by the undergrowth, gave the impression that someone had wanted to hide it without drawing too much attention. The windows were tinted, making it impossible to see inside. The man beside me noticed it too. He paused, staring at the vehicle with the same unease I felt creeping up my spine. "That wasn't here earlier, right?" he asked, though it sounded more like a statement than a question. I shook my head slowly, my heart beginning to pound again. Whoever had parked that car must have arrived sometime after I started the hike. And considering how remote the trail was, It didn't make sense for anyone to be there at this hour, unless they were connected to the group I saw deeper in the forest. Without exchanging many words, we both knew what we were thinking. Something wasn't right, and it was best to leave before we found out exactly what. He finally gave me a small nod. "Good luck," he said quietly, and with that, he turned and began walking toward the parking lot without another word. I watched him go, feeling both relieved and anxious at the same time. I hesitated for a moment, glancing back toward the trail. The thought of those figures searching in the dark still lingered in my mind. I tried to convince myself that it was just a coincidence, a strange encounter, nothing more. But deep down, I knew that something was off, even if I couldn't fully understand what it was. Taking a deep breath, I turned away and headed toward my own car, leaving the forest behind. The forest had always felt like a second home to me. I'd spent countless hours moving through its dense trails, waiting for the thrill of a good hunt. On that morning, I set out with the same sense of purpose I always did, looking forward to a day of peace, quiet, and maybe a deer or two. I had my rifle slung over my shoulder, my gear packed, and the cool autumn air on my skin. The plan was simple: head along my usual trail, make it to my favorite lookout point, and settle in to wait. Everything about the day felt ordinary at first. No movement in the undergrowth, no distant sounds of deer, just stillness, thick and oppressive. I pressed on, thinking maybe I was just unlucky. But after hours of walking with no sign of game, frustration began to set in. This was supposed to be routine. I'd hunted these woods more times than I could count. There was always something. And yet that day, there was nothing. Finally, near a narrow stretch of trail, I stumbled across fresh deer tracks. Relief washed over me, but as I knelt to inspect them, the relief was replaced by unease. The tracks were strange, uneven, as if the deer had been running in a panic. Something had frightened them, and whatever it was recent. Following the tracks, I pushed deeper into the forest toward my usual lookout point. It was a high spot, perfect for spotting game, but as I neared it, I noticed something that didn't belong. A hut. I knew every inch of this area, and this structure hadn't been here before. I crouched low, hidden in the brush, watching the hut carefully. My instincts told me to stay put, to see what I could learn before getting closer. Minutes passed. Then, out of the shadows of the forest, 3 men emerged, dragging a woman with them. She stumbled as they pulled her forward, her steps heavy and uncoordinated, like she was barely conscious. I could see her head lolling, her legs giving out beneath her. They weren't gentle. The men shoved her into the hut with an air of impatience, speaking in low voices I couldn't make out. Every nerve in my body screamed that something was wrong. I'd come out here expecting to track deer, not stumble into whatever this was. The way they handled the woman made my stomach churn. This was no accident. She wasn't lost. She had been brought here deliberately. The men stayed near the hut for a while, talking amongst themselves. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I watched, hidden and helpless. Then, just as quickly as they had appeared, they left, disappearing back into the forest, leaving the woman behind. Once the men were gone, I stayed put, forcing myself to remain hidden. My mind raced. Who were those men? What were they planning? And most importantly, what would happen if they came back? The minutes crawled by, each second more agonizing than the last. I kept my eyes fixed on the hut, waiting to see if they would return, but they didn't. The forest around me grew darker as dusk settled in, the air turning cold. I knew I couldn't wait much longer. If I was going to act, it had to be now. My hands shook as I reached for my knife, the weight of the decision pressing down on me. This wasn't what I had prepared for, this wasn't a hunt, but leaving her behind wasn't an option. With a deep breath, I stepped out of my hiding spot and moved toward the hut, keeping low to the ground. Every rustle of leaves beneath my boots felt deafening. I reached the door, heart pounding, and carefully pulled it open. The inside of the hut was as crude as its exterior, just a few blankets on the ground, an old lantern, and the woman tied up in the corner. She looked at me through half-closed eyes, her face pale, her movements slow and disoriented. "Hold on," I whispered, though the words felt empty in the silence of the forest. I knelt beside her, cutting the ropes that bound her wrists and ankles. She tried to sit up, but her body sagged against me, weak and unsteady. Whatever they had given her was still in her system, making her sluggish and barely able to stand. I knew we didn't have time. Every second we stayed there increased the risk of those men returning. I draped her arm over my shoulder, pulling her to her feet. She leaned heavily against me, her weight dragging with each step, but we had to move. We slipped out of the hut and into the forest, the underbrush thick and unforgiving. The woman stumbled over roots and rocks, her breath ragged. I kept us moving, guiding her as best I could. We just needed to put as much distance between us and that hut as possible. We pushed deeper into the forest, every step a battle against the dense underbrush. The woman was barely conscious, her weight leaning heavily against me as I guided her forward. My mind raced, calculating every step, every direction. All I knew was that we needed to stay ahead. Whatever those men were involved in, we couldn't afford to be caught. Then the sound shattered the stillness. 2 gunshots cracked through the forest, sharp and close enough to make my skin crawl. I froze for a moment, the woman sagging against me, her breath uneven. My heart raced as I looked back toward the hut, knowing exactly what those shots meant. The men had returned, and they had realized she was gone. We didn't have time to rest, not even for a second. "We need to keep moving," I whispered, though it felt like I was saying it more for myself than for her. I shifted her weight, forcing my legs to keep going, adrenaline dulling the burn in my muscles. Branches scraped at my arms and face as we pushed through the dense forest, the underbrush tangling around our legs. Every sound felt magnified, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves. I half expected to hear footsteps following close behind, but all I heard was my own heartbeat, drumming loudly in my ears. The forest seemed endless, every twist and turn stretching out ahead of us. My arms ached from supporting the woman, but I couldn't let up. Each step felt like a gamble. Too fast, and we'd risk tripping. Too slow, and we'd risk being caught. I glanced behind us, my nerves stretched thin. No signs of pursuit yet, but the tension in the air told me it wouldn't last. They were out there, and they were looking for her. We kept moving, the ground sloping downward toward the trailhead. Relief flickered at the edges of my mind as I recognized familiar markers. An old tree stump, a narrow creek. We were getting closer, just a little further. And then, through the trees, I saw it. My car, parked where I'd left it that morning. The sight of it sent a wave of energy through me, cutting through the exhaustion. We stumbled the last few feet, the woman barely able to lift her legs, and I yanked the car door open, helping her inside. I jumped into the driver's seat, slamming the door behind me, and turned the key. Gravel sprayed from the tires as we sped away, the forest shrinking behind us with every second. The drive felt like a blur. My focus locked on the road, my mind racing through the events of the past hour. The woman slumped against the seat, her head lolling, but I could see the faint rise and fall of her chest. She was alive. That was all that mattered. I drove straight to the nearest hospital, not slowing until we reached the entrance. Nurses rushed out as soon as I pulled up, their faces shifting from confusion to concern when they saw her condition. I explained what I could. My words hurried and scattered, and they whisked her inside without delay. Once she was safely admitted, I found a quiet corner and called the police. I told them everything, how I found the woman, the men at the hut, and the gunshots in the forest. The officer on the other end listened carefully, his tone calm but serious. "You did the right thing," he said. "We'll send a team to investigate immediately." The weight of the day hit me all at once as I sat there in the hospital lobby, exhaustion settling deep into my bones. But knowing she was safe made it worth it. I had done what I could.